Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Everything Design Show. Today, we have a guest all the way from New Delhi. Her name is Oshin Siao Bhatt, and she is a independent researcher in New Delhi. So she's been actually a contact that we've made recently through one of our previous speakers as well, Tiffany from the Anthropologists in Asia group. So there's a group that we're growing, and today from that group we do have Oshin here to share with us a bit about her work. And I think mainly talking a little bit about how we can be accountable when we're doing research for projects, right? So whether it's design projects or sort of more business centric projects, I think there's always going to be research that needs to be done, and how as researchers we can be accountable in the work that we do. So hi Oshin, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe Oshin, maybe you can introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, and what you're usually up to in terms of work as an independent researcher.
Yeah, sure. So, like Nicholas said, I'm based in New Delhi and I'm currently an independent researcher. I have a background in sociology and social anthropology. I studied at the Delhi School of Economics at the University of Delhi. And since getting my master's in sociology in, I think, 2016 now, I have been working across sort of the fields of design, academia, development, mostly to do with reproductive and sexual health, reproductive technologies, healthcare, women's rights, sort of the whole, that sort of space. And and I mean, I just wrapped up a project looking at sort of women's movement that was happening in New Delhi, and so those are my areas of interest, and that's where I excel in.
So you talked about your work a little bit in healthcare as well as women's rights. So as an independent researcher, do you typically are these the projects that you will usually be looking out for, or it's more of what's given to you by the clients that you're working with?
I think I started building a portfolio around these kind of projects when during my first job. So my first job after graduation was with the design research studio which is based in New Delhi, called Quicksand Design Studio. And there I did almost a year-long project looking at the future of contraceptive technologies, after which I have sort of remained in that field, I think primarily because it's something that interests me, but also because I have experience in this. So I, on the one hand, look out for it, but also it works out, I guess, for the clients who are looking for someone who sort of has worked in that space and is comfortable talking about these things, has some amount of knowledge. I mean, I know it's like kind of bordering on a lot of like scientific knowledge, which I don't claim to have, but at least from whatever I can understand outside of the space of like science and technology. I think it's a bit of both.
I mean, I think most of us, when we are working on projects, I think there is that balance a little bit, right? And especially, I think I would imagine as a researcher, you're not bound specifically to one employer, right, or one company. So I'm sure that there will be a little bit more flexibility as compared to somebody who's working with one company or just maybe one organization, or as an in-house researcher. So the work. I mean, the projects that you're doing seem to be quite interesting, and these are very real issues that I think not just India, but I think a lot of countries are also facing. So as a design researcher, how do you find the I think or how do you build your methodologies or your methods within the space in terms of its I guess its relationship back to what we typically defined as traditional anthropology or traditional ethnographic research. Do you feel that there is a strong link back to those very traditional methods and methodologies, or do you feel that as a design researcher, you have, I wouldn't say straight, but you've taken sort of paths and tools and methods that are a little bit different from what we traditionally would be associating with ethnographic research or traditional anthropology?
So I think that's a really interesting question, primarily because when I was first introduced to what design research is, somebody told me that design research borrows a lot from anthropological research, which naturally piqued my interest because I was like, that's fantastic, that's the discipline I come from. So I think there is a general effort to sort of draw from ethnographic research. I think a lot of design researchers often use that term. Sometimes it's warranted. Sometimes I would say I don't know if it's always warranted to call what we do ethnography. So yeah, I think there is definitely an attempt and to borrow from traditional ethnographic anthropological methodologies. Not to say that there is only one kind of anthropological methodology either, right? So of course there's different kinds, but I think that what I have felt in my experience is that there's always like the kind of constraints that are around sort of like a design research project. Like you have, I think, often like crunch timelines, what the sort of like pandering to the client, like always having like an end goal in mind. I think it makes it a little bit difficult to, stick to what ethnography would be in terms of a long-term observational participant based research methodology. So yeah, I think it's a mix. I think I would say I wouldn't go so far as to say it's 50-50. I would say it's maybe like, I don't know if you can quantify it, but maybe like uh, there are makings of what I would call anthropological methods, but there's also methodologies that have been built within the space of design, which I think maybe anthropologists could benefit from borrowing. And yeah, but of course I think the difference also lies in the fact that my training was within the space of academic anthropology, so I wouldn't know what it is like to be trained within an applied anthropology program either, so I can't speak to that. But I think that given the market constraints that are applied upon many design research projects, those methodologies kind of get shortchanged in some way. And I think that's something that we need to refine and think through. And I don't think it's the worst thing either, because the discipline of design can benefit from having its own methodologies that work within its own constraints.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always as a practitioner yourself, who's applying these different tools, these different methodologies in the industry, compared to a very traditional academic research anthropologist or social scientist. I think there's always this argument, right? Even when I was doing my studies in the past, when I was in the schools, and we were always, there was always this discussion to sort of say, academic is better or purer in that sense, right? As compared to as compared to practice. But I think, over the years, I think what I've seen is that there is a reason why there is a difference. We can't necessarily take like what you talk about, those constraints of the of a real life project, the crunch times, and apply it within a very traditional anthropological or social science, traditional academic type of research, right? And I think it's two separate worlds, and I think if as long as you know that you're living in two connected but separate worlds, I think that's actually, I think that's fine. And I don't really see one as better than the other. I always think I would imagine, even if I were to describe, I guess, your career, I would even say that actually, based on women's health or women's well-being, based on all these different projects that you've done, it would constitute as a full, academic, long-term, PhD style kind of research project, right? If you combine everything it together, I would say that it fulfills the requirements of a long-term research project. So I think I think it's a good point that you sort of brought out there. That these methods it can't just come from one, I guess, very traditional school of thought in that sense. So yeah, but I guess with regards to this, this idea of which school of thought or the methodologies. I think that leads us a little bit to our main topic today, which is I think what we wanted to talk about, which was I think accountability. So we did touch a little bit on design research being accountable, not just to, I guess, the academic world or from a methodological perspective, but I think we wanted to sort of ask about accountability from both the practice as well as the researchers as well. So I mean, when you spoke just now, I think one of the things that we wanted to sort of talk about is bias, right? There is, when you are researching into a culture that is similar, your own culture or someone else's culture, how do you typically call out these biases? Do you feel that the calling out your own biases is something that is easy to do, or do you feel that it's something that it's quite hard to do as a design researcher?
I don't know if it's difficult or if it's easy, so to say. I would of course lean towards saying it's not always clear, because one isn't always conscious of what your biases are or what your sort of learned assumptions, whether they be subconscious or entirely unconscious, are. But the other thing that I've always sort of worried about is that it's not a matter of difficulty or ease, it's that people don't seem to find the need to do that. I think there seems to be like an assumption that if you're coming from outside of the discipline, of the place, of the community, then you will automatically see things that someone from within the space wouldn't be privy to. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the opposite may be true, where you might in fact miss things, and you might assume certain things because you are used to it being a certain way within your own discipline or within your own community or within your own network. So I think what is important is that one always calls out where you come from, and what one always reflects back on how does your position affect your assumptions, or how does your position, not just within that project but also within society, like you call out the fact that your social class may affect it a certain way, or your gender or your sexual identity. All of those things impact how you position yourself within a project and within society itself, right? So I think accountability starts with starting to reflect back on where you stand and what that means for a project to come together, and what that means even for like the smaller, the tools that you use. Like if you have a questionnaire, when you built out that questionnaire, were you making assumptions when you're asking those questions? Of course, within anthropology, you always say ask open-ended questions, even within design research. But those open-ended questions themselves, like your question structure, the structure of your tools, the way you use them, it all has impacted from your own position. So I think it's often difficult, but I think it's also very, very necessary. And it's something that, in fact, I think we can learn from traditional anthropology, because I think within that discipline, it's older. It has maybe more room, more time to have these questions and ask these questions. So I think if there's one thing that design researchers and practitioners should borrow from that discipline, is the need to always call out and reflect back on the impact you're having on by doing that project. Not like larger impact in terms of implementation, but even the research that you do, did it impact the community you went into? Did it impact the space that you entered, warranted or unwarranted? So I think you should always make it a point to try your best to, call out your biases, like you're saying. And
Yeah.
if you can't correct them, at least like, point them out so that people can be aware that you're not assuming complete objectivity.
So, I mean, in terms of like we talk about projects within the industry. I mean, I think we do know that the projects sometimes you don't have a lot of time, right? Like there's always about crunch time. So, if you let's just say we had you have a very short time to work on this project and you're working within a team of researchers, what are the steps that you would take, to ensure that this step, of calling out your biases, whether as an individual or as a team, how do you ensure? Are there steps that you consciously take to ensure that this happens? When you do a live project.
Okay, so I'm going to be entirely honest here and tell you that, like, I have till now not had the opportunity to frame a project by myself. I have always sort of deferred to organizations or people who I've been hired by, right? So I unfortunately haven't found the ability to sort of shape it as I would like to as an individual, as a practitioner. Um, but I think it's because I've had the chance to be within these spaces that I've been increasingly made aware of the fact that this is required. So if you were to ask me, like, what do you do in this situation? I think when I imagine an ideal case scenario, and I can't assume that this is possible every time either, because I'm sure to be in the position of running an entire project is a whole different ball game, which I may not be familiar with at the moment. But I think the first step is always to ask, like, why is there a crunch time on research? I mean, this is something that I have always faced, where you would be on a project that is a year long, because you have so much time to think through the tools, and then you have so much time to think through the prototypes, and you have so much time to think through the outcomes. But the research phase within that year long project will be like 1 week, 2 weeks, okay, maximum 3 weeks. And it's always very surprising to me. I'm like, you budget all of this time. Why can't you budget some more time into going to the field? And I think the second thing that's very, very important that I've unfortunately found lacking in some of these spaces that I have had the privilege to be a part of is that there is very little faith in the fact that secondary research can be very helpful. Like, I think there is so much pressure put on the fact that if you go to the field, you will see something firsthand that you will see when you read literature is very surprising to me, because if you spend a week in the field, you can only expect to gain so much. But as opposed to that, if you are tight on budgets, if you're tight on time to travel to a space that may be for field work, then why not at least budget enough time to read through work that has been put into spaces, expertise, uh, over decades. Like, when you talk about, for example, the work that, like, the spaces that I'm privy to, healthcare, contraception, reproductive technologies, women's rights, like, centuries of work has gone into this, and you cannot assume that you or your team going into the field will find something spectacular that people who have spent their entire lives working on this uh, question wouldn't have. So of course, I'm not taking away from field work. I enjoy field work thoroughly. I love it. I live for it. But your field work, if you only have time to spend in the field, then it should be based off of thorough secondary research that you do, so that you can maximize or, like, make the most of the limited time that you have in the field. You can ask questions accordingly. Maybe you can fill the gaps that you somehow didn't find in those other kind of works that you are looking at. I think that maybe it's time to start asking, what is the kind of research that we uh, envision doing to to do social impact work, so to say, or to do research that is to an end, which we often find doing within the field of design research. You're always you have a solution oriented sort of mind space, right? So I don't have an answer for this, but I would really hope that the discipline of design and we as design practitioners start holding each other accountable and collaborate. I mean, I think what's beautiful about academia, and I'm not like a I'm not saying that academia is purer or better or anything. But what's beautiful about it is that there has been enough room and enough space for people to like say debate or collaborate to come up with methodologies and if have them evolve over time. You can't hold your tools and your methodologies as if they are like as if you have sole proprietorship over them. Exchange them, have give more importance to open source, talk to each other, and that's the only way any discipline can evolve. So if we want design research as a discipline to evolve, then we need to start having more conversations. We need to critique each other. We also need to congratulate each other if there is something that you think you didn't think of and some other organization, person, whoever thought of. I think those are some things that we need to keep in mind so that we can grow as practitioners and as designers and as design researchers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the last point that you made about us as, I guess I would say as peers, to be honest, as peers within the industry, we're always learning from each other. And I think, to be honest, I started this podcast, to really do that, to really be upfront and be honest about, the way we do things, the way we do design, the way we do research, and, to just be able to share the different ways, the tools, and to share the different techniques, the different methodologies, the different perspectives as well. I mean, today we talk about accountability in, New Delhi will be very different to accountability in Singapore or accountability in the States, and in Western culture as well. And yeah, I mean, even though you were mentioning about how you may not have had the chance yet to run these projects in your own way, but I do agree that we as I think as a practice, we do have to hold each other accountable. But I do see actually, I mean, I think there's a lot of growth, people who hold their methods too tightly. I do see that they die off, quite quickly in terms of that mindset, because you will learn that actually, I think one thing that I've seen from the industry, apart from the writers, the researchers that publish into journal articles, books, and so on and so forth, the only I would say, I think our community is quite generous, it's always, we share our techniques, we share our methodologies, we're quite friendly. We also are able to share things that are, of course, don't break any NDAs, right? Or things that are that will affect, our participants or our companies. But I think, the methods that I think everybody's quite open to sharing that. So I think yeah, that's a good point that you made, and I think that should be the way that we move forward. The only thing that I think that we see is that is the industry tries to be. I think there are individuals or organizations that I feel try to be a bit too unique. Like this. Our methods actually, if you break them down, I think across the board it's quite similar. The way we do things, the way we do design research, the way we engage with participants. Of course, there are some tweaks in terms of how we do them, but the methods, I when we break down, we look at them across the board. I would say actually they're quite similar across the board. I mean, it's just maybe named a little bit differently. We use a different matrix. We have different variables in terms of mapping our exercises or our defining stages. But the only issue I feel like from a personal perspective is that there are too many new tools and new techniques and new methodologies and I'm from a design research it becomes design innovation research, or you're adding user experience, and these are of course schools of thought that have come from many different places, but each day it seems to seem like, oh, there's a new thing, but didn't that sound very familiar to that? So I think, yeah, we are a community that shares a lot, but sometimes we may try to be a bit too unique, and I think maybe that's a designer in the industry, right? It's the very designer creative, to want to be unique in that sense, in terms of the methodologies or the frameworks that we're using. Engineering can't be too creative with the techniques or your permutations. You have a lot of problems. But yeah, I guess within the design field or the creative field, we do have a little bit of space to explore those creative juices in calling or renaming our methodologies or tweaking the methodologies or techniques that are there. Which I think it's friendly, and I guess it's fine. It's just a little bit of a observation. But yeah, as an industry wide, I think these are ways that we definitely have to consider and think about how we want to be accountable. I think that's something that we definitely have to do. The other thing also is, I think you mentioned one of these things, which I think it's it actually opened my mind just now when you mentioned it, which is, I think you said before we started the podcast, which was that you as researchers and designers, there is no way we can be 100% objective. For me, I when I teach in class, I teach people and I say, hey, we need to move away from subjective perspectives, start from our assumptions, but we cannot maintain those assumptions until we do the research, move from a subjective, affirm what our biases are, and then move that into an objective space. But when you mention that objectivity, we cannot be 100% objective, it just struck me as, it's true. We cannot be 100% objective. And that just when you said that to me, it was like, it just about just like ding. I was like, whoa, okay, yeah. Now that I think about it, so maybe but yeah.
I think what you're saying is it's so true. I mean, of course, you need to you're right in what you teach, is that you first need to question where your assumptions are coming from. But I think what we're both saying is kind of like two ways of coming at the same thing. Is that first and foremost, when you go into when I go into my first class of sociology or social anthropology, that's what you're taught, right? Like, you are everything that you know, everything that you understand is a product of socialization. So everything that you have been fed in a way, consciously or unconsciously, has framed what your thoughts are, what your positions on certain things are, and they of course keep evolving, but there also has to be a certain layer that you kind of don't have control over. So I think that one must always try to not be presumptuous, but one must also always try to call out your own assumptions about anything. So that's what I was saying initially, was that I think the one big way around it is for people to first acknowledge that there will be no objectivity. So let's just call out where we come from, let's question where we come from, and then we can start with the findings of the research. I feel like when you sort of doing your research, and then you are making it into a report or whatever, you're analyzing it. I think part of the part of the information should also be about the researchers themselves. Like, the research is not happening without the researcher. So the minute you step into a space, you are going to affect that space by the mere fact that you're present there. It is not a clean slate as one would assume that you are studying. You're already changing a place, a community, a situation by by putting yourself in that situation. And I think there is no harm in admitting to oneself that that's where my understanding comes from, or that's where my assumptions come from, because it's only human. I mean, at the end of the day, researchers are human. Everyone has. I feel like what's so interesting about working in spaces like healthcare and stuff is that one starts to even question, assumptions like, oh, are doctors objective? Because at the end of the day, doctors have a medical gaze and they have a way of looking at things, but they're also human beings. And now with so much talk about what it means to have equal access, what it means to have accessibility at large, people have started talking about how certain communities, and I mean, within the American context, maybe it's the Black community. Within the Indian context, it may be the Muslim community or the Dalit community that has so much, that has to face discrimination within spaces that you would assume are objective, like medicine. So if those extremely scientific, apparently rigorously scientific spaces can't be objective, then how can we as qualitative researchers assume that we're objective? Like that is just something that I think is impossible, and I think that one should just admit it and learn from, of course, our mistakes, or learn from people who are willing to teach us or not willing to teach us, learn on your own, but always call out where you come from and always call out the fact that you recognize that you will have bias. Even if you don't know what those biases are, you must recognize that you will have. And I think that's where we need to start that's how accountability sort of starts, right? To yourself, to the people you're going to be who are going to be participating in your study, to the people who are going to be reading your study. You have to also be accountable to the audience of your research. And yeah, I think also I wanted to add about what you were saying earlier about, you know, our practice of design, our discipline being fairly open and friendly. I completely agree. I think what's beautiful is that people do share. You're also right in that people try very hard to be unique. Maybe that comes from a place of wanting to be creative, but maybe also because there is so much competition in the market, you have to be unique. But I think we also need to, at the same time, develop a culture of being. I mean, you can be friendly, but don't always try to be nice. I mean, let's also critique each other, you know, because critique, debate, that's what helps things evolve. If you keep trying to be polite and say yours is great and mine is great, well, maybe not, you know, maybe mine is problematic and yours is problematic, and I'm not going to see it till somebody else calls it out. So I think there also needs to be that sense of accountability and that sense of calling out of biases. Is that, do we as a discipline, as a network, as a conglomerate of design practitioners assume that design has an answer to everything, or that design is perfect? Because that in itself is also could be a problematic bias or an assumption that we have. So let's start by questioning why we're doing what we're doing. What is the role that design plays in the larger space of socio-political, economic realities? And it does play a role because obviously it's part of society. So it will naturally play some sort of role. And I think like that's what I have my anthropology training to thank for, is that everything is constantly affecting everything. Like there is nothing that can be in a vacuum, including our own biases, including our own discipline, including our own practice. So yeah, I think I went on long.
No,
rant,
that's good.
but,
That's good. Yeah, I mean, we separated it into two things. I think. I mean, the being accountable is not just being accountable to the research itself, all right, but it's also being accountable to the field, right? Not just as researchers, you know, to the participants of our study or the context that we're looking at. I think the accountability definitely has to come from. We always have to look at the field. I mean, even we were talking about, you know, in some of our chats, right? I think this discussion came up about, you know, yes, the origins of, you know, the historical significance of, you know, social science research has come from a Western context, right? You know, the Western schools of thought. But you know, now that the more the Asian community is growing, the techniques that may fit within a very Western context, you know, very traditional, like let's say, you know, Gertz or Menelowski sort of looking from a Western approach into a third world country or a third world community in that sense, right? I think those structures are very, you know, are very rare nowadays, right? I mean, you know, like for yourself, you know, you're in, you know, you're a native in New Delhi and you're researching within New Delhi, you know, so the I think the dynamic is very different, and for us to be you know, I think as an industry we need to be accountable to say that you know, it's not one sort of one a very a puzzle piece that is going to fit within every whole, right? The whole is constantly changing, constantly evolving, depending on what kind of scope you're taking. But I mean, I've always actually personally, on a personal note, I think I've always been very fearful, being somebody who maybe it's my Asian upbringing, I'm not sure, where I don't really challenge patriarchy that much, or hierarchy to that certain extent. But yeah, I do admit that sometimes I do feel that whether it's from an academic perspective or whether it's from a professional perspective, there are some points that are worth critiquing. But I think it's a good reminder, especially to myself, definitely, to say that for me to be accountable to the industry and the field of design research, I also need to stand up and critique what I feel is not really right, or what I feel can be improved. I think being accountable has many facets. One in terms of the research perspective, right? Talk about ethics, biases of the research, which is true, but definitely I think in terms of our voice, I feel in terms of the new ways we are doing things. And now even now you think about it, the world is changing with COVID, right? With a pandemic. How we do research, I think, will also change. And do we still want to hold on to these very traditional ideologies, or these very traditional methods or perspectives? And the way we used to communicate 10, 15 years ago, it's very different from how we communicate now, right? Every generation after us, the way they behave, the way they communicate, the way they speak, the way they engage, is also very different. So the tools that we've been used to from the past to the present are changing and will continue to change. So I think that's definitely a good point that you've made in terms of that. Yeah. So sorry, you're saying? No, you go. Keep going. Yeah.
No, I was just saying that you're completely right, and I think what you said about social sciences, and especially anthropology, what we have talked about in the past, being drawn from that Western-centric, approach. Like, when you come to think about the history of anthropology, it was primarily introduced so that the colonizers could understand the other, which were the colonized, and especially in the context of Asia, and I'm sure in the context of many African countries, that becomes such a real thing for us, because we are the post colonies, especially in the Indian context there. And it's something that you can see in your everyday life. Like, so much is affected by it, and I think that's what's really fascinating when you think about what design draws from anthropology. And one of my biggest fears is that it has drawn the tendency to constantly borrow from the West. Like, why must we do that? Asia is replete with amazing, brilliant people, with practitioners who are very, very capable and willing to come up with, like you said, tools, methodologies, ideas that fit better here, because it's exactly like you said, it's not a puzzle piece. It's not something that will fit right in one context. So something that irks me so much is that when people in the same breath say, I did research in Africa and India. First of all, Africa is a continent, India is a country. Secondly, those two contexts are completely different. How can you even think that those two things in any way will align when histories are maybe in terms of colonization similar, but still completely diverse? Cultures are diverse, communities are diverse, not to mention that both of those regions themselves, if you were to even think of them not as countries or continents, but just regions, are so diverse that I can't ever claim that I did research in New Delhi and I know what's happening in, I don't know, like Rajasthan, which is, by the way, almost a neighboring state. But I don't know, because I have not done research there. And already those differences and those nuances need to constantly be acknowledged and recognized, especially as practitioners who work within the qualitative research space. Like quantitative research, when you work with numbers, I don't understand it at all, so I'm not going to speak to it. But maybe there is more room to like generalize. With qualitative research, when you're relying on narratives, stories, everyday lived experiences, how can you ever make these broad assumptions? Is something that I'm completely opposed to it, and I completely agree with you in that like people who are not from the West, or like our communities, and are, I think, practitioners within Asia, within India, within Singapore, within Hong Kong, within everywhere, need to like promote the work that we do and not constantly, borrow from, of course, like IDEO, Frog. They're always going to be well known. Their work will always be well revered. But how long are we going to be dependent on basically completely Western organizations?
Yeah,
So,
let's strive to be the I don't know if there's an Asian frog, but the Asian frogs or the Asian ideals in that sense. Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely want that to happen, right? We want to be able to I think promote for, not for the sake of promoting, right? It's not to bring up just a specific culture, but it's just to I think bring out that authenticity of that cultures. Because even I think what you mentioned about you even in the neighboring state, you don't know enough. But I actually feel that because you live in that in Delhi and you are in the neighboring state, I'm sure your day-to-day interactions with the people around you, even they may be from either different dialect groups or caste systems or different different religions, right? I'm sure that through a very porous kind of interaction that you're dealing with them, you do have that knowledge. I'm sure there is, like, I mean, for people, like even in myself, I when I observe people, even though it's not work related or not, I'm not really looking at them as a research participant, or they're not my research subjects. I look at them as human beings, and I observe their behaviors, and what they show me is, it's an amalgamation of my perspective on that an older generation or a younger generation, and now with social media, let's say I look at the hashtag of Singapore and what people are doing, where people are hanging out. I think the ways that we observe behavior, and sit down in a cafe, watch people, things like that. Now, it's changing, and because we're in that, you're in that context. I'm sure you of course, yes, admit to the biases, of course, admit to the assumptions. But I think we need to have some. I think some credit needs to go into the. I think some credit needs to go into the fact that you or I am a researcher within the context that I'm living in, and that actually holds, I feel, a lot of value than if you were to helicopter someone in to do that research. I'm not saying that it will be useless to get that person to come in from a third person's perspective, but what I'm saying is that because you are in that you've lived in that community, you're constantly engaging from a day-to-day basis. Even if you're not working, you're still observing, right? You hang out with your friends. There may be other people who are, at other tables. You're interacting with, you observe them, you listen to them. Whether we're eavesdropping is another question.
Yeah.
But I think being
I think you can't avoid eavesdropping as a researcher.
But I think that really I think drives home that point that we I think as researchers, especially if you're a researcher that's coming from a local context, and within that lived context, if you're not observing the things that are happening around you, then I would suggest that you start doing that, right? As a researcher. And I think I've been trained, I think, having learned, design and anthropology, I can't really turn it off, It's very hard to turn off, when I'm watching people interact with each other. Not that I'm trying to look out for people who are committing crimes, in that sense. I'm not being a surveillance, I'm not being a surveillance kind of person, but I'm just being an observer, like, oh, how are people interacting? How are they queuing? How are they buying things? What languages are they speaking? How are they interacting with families? If I look at my neighbors, I look at the people, who the communities that play different sports and things like that. And I think that's something that we cannot take away. I think as researchers, it's you're constantly observing, and I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. I think as an Asian community, when we're looking at it, we should be giving value to ourselves, and selling that as a real technique. And I mean, to be honest, so Microsoft used to do it. I mean, with Genevieve Bell, right? Genevieve Bell, one of the early design researchers. Whenever Intel, whenever Intel had to go to a new country, they would always hire a local researcher. The from what they've been sharing. It's always about hiring a local researcher, because the local researcher knows about the different nuances. And I think that's something we need to value a lot, as I think as researchers who are researching within our own context. May not be the same, our own religion or our own race, but our own class, but I think within our own lived context, I think that's something that's quite valuable. Yeah,
I completely agree, and I think like the importance of like local researchers is immeasurable. But I do want to add that, like, having worked some amount with Western organizations that have, for whatever reason, chosen to study, some parts of India, because I feel like that's something that they really, really enjoy doing. I don't know why we don't see as many, especially development organizations in the West, kind of like studying their own societies. It's not like there is nothing to study there, but somehow they really, really enjoy coming to the developing world, so to say. But I think one thing that, if we are to address them, like us as maybe potentially local researchers, and not just for myself, because I've been in teams where even more local people have been hired as, say, research assistants. I have been a research assistant myself at some point or the other. And I think what's important is that if you look at someone as a research assistant, it should not be limited to them being your translators. They are not just translators. They are not even just cultural translators. You have to involve them in the larger analysis, in the larger writing, in the larger process of the project, because otherwise, if you just fly in and then you are sort of like in a space where somebody is just kind of doing the translation for your interviewing, or someone's just sort of, giving you tips and tricks later in the back, and then you go home and like do the entire report yourself, I don't know how much value that has. Whereas that person is like a gold mine of knowledge, of resources, like you said, of understanding the culture. And that person should very much be involved through and through. It can't be like just for the phase of field research you go and do it, and then the rest you kind of like forget about them. And I think that's another important point, for not just like when you're in a time crunch. If you're in a time crunch for field research, make sure that your local field researchers are not only hired for the phase of that, the field research, and also secondly, if you have to be accountable, then your accountability has to go as far as hiring people, maybe even from that community, because when we as researchers go in, I'm always wondering, like, I'm taking so much from this community. I'm taking their time. They are giving me intimate information about themselves, especially in the fields that I work in, healthcare, sexual and reproductive health. It's things people don't share easily. But what do I give back? If I can at least, like, hire someone local, if I can at least involve them in some way or the other, then it's not just like, you give them money for the time they spend, because that's also a controversial topic. Do you pay your respondents or not? But that's a different thing.
Yeah.
But give them money for, or give them resources to actually build something. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, maybe that's one way that Western researchers, or even me as a privileged researcher going to a less privileged space, need to reevaluate how we involve the local community. communities and, like you said, local researchers.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very 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 big topic. I mean, we've only scratched the surface, to be honest.
Yeah,
I think there's
definitely.
more things that we can discuss. But yeah, I think that really, from today's podcast, I think this whole idea of accountability is something that we need to be reminded of, right? In terms of accountability to the research participants, accountability to the research topic or the project itself. We also spoke about accountability as a conglomerate, like you're talking about, right? Or as a community of researchers or design researchers. Both from a global perspective as well as an Asian perspective, where we're not just sharing information, sharing methods, sharing techniques, but I think we're able to critique each other openly and honestly, not for the sake of just to critique and put people down, right? But also in terms of I think bringing value. I think the last point that you made, to which I think that there have been some research teams where they did I'm sure there are some cases where they've hired locals not to be the researchers, but to just be that voice on the ground. I mean, it's. I mean, I wouldn't want to devalue them and say that they're tour guides, right? But actually, a tour guide provides you with a lot of value. An honest tour guide, not a tour guide that's just telling you and trying to sell you things and get you to go to this particular restaurant or buy from this particular shop, right? But I think the value of a real tour guide is really to expose you to the real local cultures and what is happening. And I think from a research perspective, not to say that we all should be tour guides, right? But I think if we can allow a local to show us the way and to guide the research as well, to contribute to the research, the analysis, the methods. I think that will definitely bring a lot of value. I mean, it's it is not just about collecting the research, but even the local person within that culture will be able to tell us, what are they comfortable with, what are they not comfortable with, right? So yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that we can think about, and we can consider when we talk about accountability. So I think we spoke about quite a few different levels of accountability here. So yeah, that's very good. So yeah, before we end off today, Oshin, was there anything else that you like to maybe end off with, or want to share about what we spoke about, or any last thoughts about today's topic of accountability and in design research?
Not really. I think I spoke a lot, but I think, like you said, it's something that our discipline, we as practitioners, need to really push for. Like, I think it's time. I think it's also at this point in the world where you're saying that things are anyway changing with the pandemic, with people speaking up against oppression, with people generally becoming tired of being put down. Not that that's something that our discipline does, but we have to be very very conscious of the kind of work we do, and we cannot be complacent anymore, and we cannot be borrowing from disciplines or spaces that are in any way oppressive. We have to find our own voice, we have to push back, we have to hold each other accountable. And I think design is a wonderful space. I think it really allows for so much dialogue. It really allows for innovation, even though that word has become such a buzzword. It does allow for it, but I think that can only be useful if we start talking about these things. And this is just, like you said, this is just the start. It's just the conversation that we're having, and we're only scratching the surface. So I hope that this conversation can, be taken further within more formalized settings, within organizations, within classrooms like yours. And yeah, I'm excited for this conversation to really, take off. from here, from other spaces also.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I would say this is a gold mine, this, in terms of what we spoke about today. And I will definitely be sharing this in my classes, and I'll elaborate a little bit more, especially about accountability from on those different levels. So I guess, Oshin and I, we should, write at least a blog post about this soon, right?
Yes.
We'll work on it, and then we'll write about this and write about accountability within design research. So stay tuned for that. It will come out soon, right? So we'll do that, and then we'll write one topic. Yeah. So I guess with that in mind, I'd like to thank you all for listening to this episode of the podcast. I want to thank Oshin for sharing her thoughts and her views and perspectives on design research in New Delhi, and especially talking about our topic today about accountability. Thank you very much, Oshin, for your time. Thanks for.
It was really fun.
Thank you for coming. I mean, I was engaged. Of course, as the host, I have to be engaged, but I'm not engaged.
You don't have an option.
I don't have an option. But I was 100% engaged. Maybe other times I'm maybe only 99% engaged, but I was definitely 100% engaged today, and I definitely was. I think it's a topic that's I think been quite close to my heart in terms of ensuring that we are all accountable to the different stakeholders that are out there. So with that in mind, we'll end off this episode. Thanks everybody for listening, and thanks again, Oshin. Please do if you like what we are sharing today, or you have any ideas in terms of what you want to hear for the other episodes, or you have any people that you like to bring you think I should be inviting, please let them know. Please share this podcast with them, and please we want to be able to grow the community. So with that in mind, all right, thank you very much for listening to the Everyday Design Show, Everything Design Show. Thanks, Oshin, for coming on with us today. See you.